The guy chooses the Necromancer class and puts all his points into brute physical strength. 0 in intelligence. In 1,000 years, no one on the continent has ever done this. The system flickers as if it can't believe what it's seeing. But let's start from the beginning. On the continent of Morwyn, magic decides everything. Who you were born as, who you will become, who you will be allowed to be. At 15, everyone undergoes the ritual of awakening. The system touches you and stamps your class. Warrior, mage, assassin, paladin, healer, necromancer. Dozens of paths, but 0 freedom. Over 1,000 years, the sages have turned stat allocation into sacred scripture. A warrior builds strength, a mage builds intelligence, an assassin builds dexterity. These are the canons, unbreakable, absolute, hammered into our heads since childhood. To deviate from the canon is to spit in the face of a 1,000-year-old tradition. Heresy, madness, a path to nowhere. So say the textbooks. So say the professors. So says everyone. At the top of the pyramid stands the High March Battle Academy. Ancient walls of gray stone, towers reaching into the clouds, arenas carved into the rock. This is where the elite are forged. Heirs of great houses, geniuses with perfect stats, the best of the best. Every year, thousands of families send their children to face the trials. Every year, hundreds return empty-handed. Getting into High March is an honor. To stay is a feat. But this year, among the glittering crowd of heirs, stands one whom no one expected. Kell. 17 years old, no family to back him up, no surname on a coat of arms, not a single coin in his pocket. An orphan from the eastern slums. He grew up in the alleys where rats ran over the feet of the sleeping, where food was fought for with fists, where there were no textbooks, only knives. In the slums, there was only one law. The strong eat, the weak leave. Kell ate. He learned to fight before he learned to speak, to strike before he could read, to survive before he could think of the future. And now he stands in the vast hall of High March, surrounded by silk robes and ancestral blades, a ragamuffin among princes, a speck of dirt on a white tablecloth. The heirs cast glances his way. One grimaces, another smirks. The guy in the blue robe with the golden crest looks at Kell as if he were a cockroach that had crawled onto the dining table. Kell stands motionless. His face is stony. He's used to it. In the slums, they look at him the same way. Only there, a fist follows the contempt. Here, for now, they just look. The altar of awakening stands in the center of the hall, white stone polished by thousands of hands. The runes pulsate with a soft light. The novices approach one by one. They place a hand on it. A light flashes. The system's voice echoes through the hall. First, a flash. A warrior. The hall hums with approval. A strong class, reliable. Second, elemental mage. The hall applauds. An elite class. Third, a girl with silver hair and a crest on her cloak. Paladin of light. The hall erupts. The heiress of the paladin lineage receives her ancestral class. Everything by the book. Everything as it should be. Swordsman, alchemist, summoner. The world runs like clockwork. And now Kell approaches the altar. The hall falls silent. Not out of respect, out of curiosity. A ragged kid from the slums at the altar, surely a trash class. Kell places his palm on the stone. The cold stings his fingers. It rises to his wrist, reaches his shoulder. A light flares. Not white, not gold, a dirty green, almost black. Shadows dance across the walls. The system's voice utters a single word. Necromancer. A second of silence. 2. Then laughter. Quiet at first, like a rustle. Then louder. One snorts. Another sniffs. The guy in the blue robe roars with laughter and doesn't even try to hide it. Necromancer. The worst combat class in the High March hierarchy. The most pathetic. The most despised. According to canon, a necromancer is a shadow. He stands in the back row, raises skeletons, hides behind a wall of dead bones, wields a staff from behind others' backs. Frail, slow, useless without the undead. A necromancer in hand-to-hand combat isn't an insult. It's a joke for freshmen. The hall roars with laughter. Kell removes his hand from the altar. He doesn't smile, he doesn't frown, he doesn't clench his teeth. He stares intently at everyone who is laughing, slowly, face by face, memorizing. Then he walks across the entire hall and sits down on a bench in the far corner, alone. Emptiness surrounds him. No one wants to sit next to a necromancer. The system opens a translucent window in front of him. Attributes: strength, dexterity, stamina, intelligence, willpower, perception, all at base level. 10 free points. The Necromancer's canon was set in stone 1,000 years ago, all into intelligence, max out intelligence. Maybe 1 point in stamina so he doesn't collapse from his own spell. Intelligence fuels necromancy. It enhances control. It determines how many dead you'll raise and how long they'll last. Every child in Morwyn knows this. It's written in every textbook. Kell looks out the window. He's never opened a textbook. He doesn't know what's written in the canons. But he knows something else. The rules are written by those who stand to gain from you following them. In the slums, they told him that there was no place for orphans among people. That for those like him, there was only one path, downward. He didn't listen then. He isn't going to listen now. His gaze slides over the intelligence row. The canon demands he put everything here. Kell shifts his gaze downward. Strength. He taps it with a finger. 1 point, 2, 3, 5, 8. 8 points in raw physical strength. He throws the remaining 2 into dexterity. Intelligence remains at 0. The system flashes. The window trembles, as if the system itself doesn't believe what it's seeing. A necromancer without a single point in intelligence. No one has done this in 1,000 years. Kell confirms the allocation. The window closes. He clenches his right fist. The muscles of his forearms swell beneath his skin. A heaviness courses through his body. Unfamiliar, thick, hot. His hands are now the hands of a fighter. His legs are the legs of a predator. And the class still says one word: Necromancer. By all the laws of magic, he has just killed himself. A necromancer without intelligence is a dead man who still breathes. Any professor would say so. Any textbook. Any canon. Kell stands up. He cracks his neck. He shrugs. He doesn't know that in a few days, this hall will fall silent at the mention of his name. Not from laughter, from fear. The first week at High March was torture, not physical. Kell was used to pain. The torture was of a different kind. Contempt. It oozed from every corner, from every glance, from every whisper behind his back. Necromancer. The word sounded like a death sentence. The professors looked at him with polite indifference, his classmates with outright disgust. In the dining hall, people moved away from him. In the hallways, they gave him a wide berth. In his theory of magic classes, the professor never once addressed him with a question. Why ask a necromancer? He'd just stand in the back row and wave his staff anyway. Kell remained silent. He attended lectures, sat in the back row, listened. He memorized. And every morning before dawn, he would go to the academy's backyard where the training posts stood. There he would strike, for hours, with his bare fists. The post shook from the blows. The skin on his knuckles split open. Blood dripped onto the stones. He wrapped his hands in rags and struck again. Strength pulsed through his body, new, unfamiliar, wild. 8 points in raw physical power had turned his thin body into a weapon. Every blow drove a crack into the wood of the post. Every day, the post had to be replaced. No one saw this. No one came to the backyard at 4 in the morning. A necromancer had no need to train his body. Everyone knew that. Midweek, they announced the introductory sparring matches, a High March tradition. Every new class went through them. The professors assessed the students' combat potential. The strongest received the highest ranking. The weakest remained at the bottom. The ranking determined everything: access to resources, the mentor's attention, a place in the class hierarchy. The sparring matches took place in the academy's main arena. Stone stands in a semicircle, a sandy floor, runes of protection along the perimeter. The hall was full. Freshmen sat in the lower rows, upperclassmen in the upper ones. The professors were in a separate box. Sparring matches followed one after another, warrior against warrior, mage against mage, everything by the book, everything predictable. The strong won, the weak fell. A guy in a blue robe with a golden crest was up third. His name was Cassius Vane, 18 years old, heir to the strongest warrior clan on the continent. Knight class, the perfect build, all stats allocated by the book. Strength, stamina, a little agility. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with short-cropped blonde hair and a haughty jawline. His family sword hung from his belt like an ornament. He didn't even need to draw it. His opponent lasted 20 seconds. Cassius knocked him down with a single blow of his shield and pinned him to the ground. The hall erupted roared. The best student in the class. That was how it had been until that day. The sparring matches continued. Kell sat on the edge of the stands and waited. He knew he would be called last, the Necromancer. A warm-up for the crowd, a trash fight for laughs. That's exactly what happened. The announcer called his name. A ripple of laughter swept through the stands. Kell stood up and walked into the arena. The sand crunched under his boots. He stood in the center of the circle and looked up. Hundreds of faces were staring at him, with curiosity, with derision, with the outcome already written in their eyes. His opponent entered the arena. Not Cassius, someone simpler. A swordsman of average build, strong, confident, with the proper canonical build. The swordsman looked down at Kell and smirked. He said the necromancer should grab his staff while he still had the chance. Kell didn't answer. The swordsman drew his blade. He took his stance. Everything by the book. The professor in the box gave the signal to begin. The swordsman stepped forward. Kell stamped his foot on the ground. The sand cracked. Bones emerged from beneath the surface. 3 skeletons rose behind him, crooked, uneven, weak by a true necromancer's standards. Raising them without any intelligence had cost him his life. Sweat beaded on his temples, but they stood, and they moved. The hall froze for a second. Then it relaxed again. Skeletons, a typical necromancer. He'll hide behind them and poke at him with a staff from a distance. The swordsman moved toward the skeletons. He cut the first one down with a single blow. Bones scattered across the arena. The second skeleton clamped onto his arm. A third came up from behind and grabbed his leg. The swordsman growled and hacked at them. It was easy. The skeletons were weak. He finished off the second one in 3 strikes. He kicked the third one and smashed it to pieces. He raised his head and began scanning the arena for the necromancer. Kell was standing right in front of him, 2 steps away. No staff, no weapon. The swordsman didn't have time to be surprised. Kell's fist slammed into his jaw. The blow was so powerful that the swordsman's head jerked to the side. His eyes rolled back. His body went limp. He fell onto the sand and didn't move. 1 blow. The necromancer had knocked out the swordsman with a single bare-fisted punch. The arena fell silent. The silence was so thick you could hear the grains of sand falling from the motionless body. Kell stood over the fallen man, shaking his hand. The knuckles were raw. Blood dripped onto the sand. But the swordsman lay there and did not get up. In the stands, someone dropped a goblet. The clang of metal against stone sounded like thunder. The professor in the box slowly rose from his chair. His pointer slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. No one noticed. Everyone was watching the arena. Cassius Vane sat in the front row. His smile vanished. His eyes narrowed. He looked at the fallen swordsman and the necromancer standing over him, and he couldn't understand what had happened. It was impossible, by every rule, according to every textbook, according to all the laws of magic. A necromancer doesn't fight in close combat. A necromancer doesn't knock out a swordsman with a fist. A necromancer hides. A necromancer is weak. That's how it's written. That's how it's always been. Kell raised his head and looked at the stands, at the hundreds of stunned faces, at the professor with his mouth agape, at Cassius with his knuckles white. He brushed the blood from his hand and spoke softly, yet so that everyone in the hall could hear. He said that, according to their books, he wasn't supposed to be able to do that, and that it was time to rewrite those books. Silence. Not a sound, not a sigh. The High March arena was silent for the first time in 100 years. Kell turned and walked toward the exit. His back was straight. His stride was steady. Behind him, lying on the sand, was a swordsman of noble birth with the proper canonical build. Unconscious. From a single blow by the necromancer. The world didn't yet understand what had happened, but the crack had already appeared. In the canons. In the rules. In everything they considered unshakable. By evening of that same day, the entire academy knew about the fight. The rumors spread through the corridors like smoke. The necromancer had knocked out the swordsman with his fist, one blow, without a weapon, without a staff, with his bare hands. It sounded like nonsense, like a bad joke, but dozens of people had seen it with their own eyes and had no intention of keeping quiet. In the dining hall, Kell sat in his usual spot in the far corner, but now, surrounding him was not the emptiness of contempt, but a different kind of emptiness. People weren't moving away in disgust. They were moving away with wariness. The difference was enormous. Kell ate in silence. His right hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth. His knuckles throbbed with a dull ache. He was used to this pain. In the slums, his hands ached every day. In the faculty box, a debate was underway. 5 professors sat at a long table made of dark wood. At the head of the table stood the academy's rector, Aldrich Highmarch, 70 years old. A tall, gaunt old man with a white beard and eyes the color of steel. A descendant of the founder, the guardian of the canons. He listened and remained silent. The professor of combat tactics was flushed with indignation. He argued that what had happened in the arena was an anomaly, and that a necromancer build with 0 intelligence contradicted all the fundamentals of magic. He insisted on an investigation and possible expulsion. The professor of class theory nodded in agreement. She claimed that Kell's stat allocation was a direct affront to the canons. A necromancer is obligated to invest in intelligence. It is the foundation. It is an axiom. The boy is either a fraud or a madman. At the other end of the table sat a woman who remained silent, Professor Leora, 22 years old, the youngest instructor in the history of High March, author of a monograph on the proper distribution of points across classes. Her textbook sat on every shelf on the continent. She sat motionless, staring at her notes. In her notebook was a diagram of Kell's attributes: 8 points in strength, 2 in dexterity, 0 in intelligence, 0. Beneath the diagram, she wrote 2 words: "It's impossible." Then she crossed them out and wrote them again: "It's impossible," and crossed them out again, because he had done it, and the impossible had become a fact. Rector Aldrich raised his hand. The hall fell silent. He asked one simple question. He asked whether Kell's point distribution was a violation of the system's rules, not the canons, not the traditions, the rules of the system itself. Silence. The professor of combat tactics opened his mouth and closed it. The professor of class theory looked away. Leora stared at her notebook. The answer was obvious. No. The system allowed points to be allocated anywhere. Technically, there was no violation. The system did not forbid a necromancer from leveling up. The system did not forbid anything at all. The canons forbade it. And the canons are not the laws of the system. Canons are human traditions. The rector nodded. He said the boy would stay, but he would be monitored. The professor of combat tactics began to object, but the rector's gaze silenced him. Aldrich Highmarch didn't have to say it twice. The meeting ended. Leora was the last to leave. She clutched her notebook to her chest and walked briskly down the hallway. Her thoughts were racing. For 12 years she had studied the class system, since she was 10, a child prodigy, a genius of magic theory. Her monograph had been accepted as gospel, and now some street urchin with fists and zero intellect had refuted half her work with a single blow. She should have hated him, but instead of hatred, something else burned within her. Curiosity, a searing, unstoppable curiosity. The next morning, during combat training, Kell discovered that the world around him had changed. The students were no longer laughing. They were watching. Silently. Appraisingly. Some with interest. Some with apprehension. Some with undisguised malice. The latter were most numerous among the heirs of the great houses. Their world was built on canon. Their families had honed the correct builds for centuries. Their superiority rested on the fact that they knew how it should be done, while the rest did not. And now a nobody had come out of nowhere and shattered that wall with a single fist. Cassius Vane wasn't looking at Kell. He sat in the front row, his face a stony mask. But his fingers dug into the edge of the bench so that his knuckles turned white. A girl sat next to him, Helga Frost, 18 years old, class president, the strongest swordswoman in the class. Tall and slender, with ash blonde hair tied in a bun, and gray eyes that made you want to look away. Helga was a perfectionist. Every movement was precise. Every attribute was perfectly balanced. Every canon was followed to the letter. She was the living embodiment of the perfect build, and what had happened in the arena offended her to the core, not because Kell had won, but because he had won the wrong way, chaotically, messily, contrary to everything she had dedicated her life to. She looked at him, and her eyes were two pieces of gray ice. Kell caught her gaze. "You held it," then looked away, not out of fear, out of indifference. This stung Helga more than she expected. On the other side of the hall sat another observer, Seraphine Aldermont, 17 years old, heir to an ancient line of paladins, silver hair, straight back, a gaze full of righteous fire. The Aldermont family had been exterminating the undead for centuries. It was their calling, their duty, their purpose. Necromancy was a desecration to them, and a necromancer who was even stronger than knights was something so repulsive that Seraphine's jaw clenched every time she looked at him. She hated him, hated everything he stood for. A defiler, a heretic, a transgressor. She had already decided what she would do to him. But not now, later, when the time came. Professor Garrick sat in the corner of the faculty box and watched. 58 years old, graying temples, a scar across his left eyebrow. A quiet man whom the students considered harmless. He taught the history of magic, a boring subject, a boring professor. No one knew that in his youth, Garrick had also tried to break the system. He had distributed points against the rules. He was caught. He was broken, forced to redistribute them, driven back into line. For 40 years he had kept silent about it. For 40 years he had carried it within him like an unhealed wound. And now he was looking at the boy with broken knuckles who had done what he himself hadn't had the strength to do. And for the first time in 40 years, Garrick smiled. 10 days had passed since the sparring match. Kell continued to live by his own schedule, up before dawn, training in the backyard. Lectures, silence, training, sleep. He struck the posts, ran across the roofs of the utility buildings, practiced dodges against his shadow. His body grew faster and tougher with each passing day. The system rewarded his efforts. New points for levels dropped into strength and dexterity. not a single one in intelligence. He tried to raise the undead every evening in the basement of the abandoned wing of the academy. Without intelligence, it was torture. Every skeleton was a struggle. Sweat poured into his eyes, his muscles trembled, his head split with the strain. 3 skeletons was his limit. The 4th crumbled before it had even stood for a second. A proper necromancer with full intellect could raise a dozen in a single effort. Kell raised 3 and paid for it with blood from his nose. But they stood. They obeyed. And Kell began to understand something important. His skeletons did not obey intellect, not a magic formula, not a canonical link between brain and dead flesh. They obeyed will. His will. Iron, stubborn, unyielding, forged in the slums where giving up meant dying. He commanded, and they rose. Not because his intellect fueled the spell, but because he would not accept refusal. It was a discovery that would have turned the whole world upside down if anyone had found out about it. Necromancy depends not on intellect, but on will. But Kell wasn't thinking about scientific discoveries. He was thinking about how to raise a 4th skeleton. On the 11th day after the sparring match, they found him. He was standing in the backyard, practicing his strikes on a pole, when footsteps sounded behind him. He turned around. Seraphine Aldermont stood 20 paces away from him. Her silver hair shone in the morning light. She wore the Aldermont family's ceremonial cloak, white with a golden sun on the back. In her hand, she held a paladin's ceremonial blade. Her eyes were ablaze. Kell recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had come to kill. Not to fight, to kill. 4 people stood behind her, upperclassmen, witnesses, seconds. Seraphine spoke. Her voice was icy and steady. She called him a defiler. She said that the House of Aldermont had cleansed the world of necromancy for centuries, and that his very existence within the walls of Highmarch was a disgrace to the Academy. She challenged him to a trial by combat, a ritual duel by ancient rules, until one of the combatants could no longer stand. Kell looked at her, then at the 4 behind her, then back at her. He asked only one thing. He asked when. Seraphine replied, now. An hour later, the dueling arena was packed. The news had spread instantly. The heiress of the paladin line against an upstart necromancer. Holy magic against desecration. This was not just a duel. It was a trial. Students crammed into the stands so tightly there was nowhere to sit. The professors took their box. Rector Aldrich had come in person. His face was expressionless. Kell stood at one end of the arena, unarmed, without a staff. His hands were wrapped in rags. Seraphine stood at the other, a paladin's blade in her right hand. Her left palm glowed with golden fire. Holy magic, honed for centuries against the undead. Techniques that burned the dead to ashes. Every skeleton raised by a necromancer crumbled at a single touch of holy light. That was her trump card, her legacy, her ultimate weapon against what Kell was. The head professor gave the signal. Seraphine attacked first. She was fast, very fast. The blade sliced through the air a millimeter from Kell's face. He dodged. She struck again. And again, a series of precise, deadly strikes honed by thousands of repetitions. The Aldermont technique, flawless. Kell dodged, retreated, moved. His body reacted before his mind had time to think. The agility points were doing their job. Seraphine frowned. A necromancer shouldn't move like that. A necromancer is slow, frail. It's written in every handbook. She increased the pressure. The golden light on her left hand flared brighter. She thrust her palm forward. A wave of holy energy struck the arena. It was a spell designed to destroy the undead. Any skeleton or zombie within a 10-meter radius would crumble to dust. Kell didn't raise skeletons. The wave passed right through him and did nothing. Holy magic is useless against the living, and Kell was very much alive. Seraphine was momentarily thrown off balance. Her entire arsenal was tailored for fighting the undead. Half her techniques only worked against the dead, and standing before her was a necromancer who fought like a street fighter. Without the undead, no staff, no magic, just his fists. Kell saw an opening. He stepped forward. With his left hand, he deflected her blade to the side. His right fist came straight in. The blow landed in the solar plexus. Not in the face, not in the jaw. He didn't want to maim her. He wanted to stop her. Seraphine doubled over. The air rushed out of her lungs all at once. The blade slipped from her fingers and clattered against the arena stone. She fell to one knee, then to the other. The golden light on her palm faded. She tried to breathe and couldn't. The hall watched in silence. The heir to the line of undead slayers stood on her knees before the necromancer. Her holy magic had proved useless. Her age-old techniques had failed. Because Kell hadn't played by the rules. He hadn't hidden behind skeletons. He hadn't let her use her greatest weapon. He'd simply walked up and struck, just like on the street. Kell held out his hand to her. Seraphine lifted her head. Her eyes were wet, not from pain, from devastation. Everything she believed in, everything she had been taught, everything her lineage had existed for 1,000 years to uphold, it had just crumbled in this arena. Kell stood over her and waited. She didn't take his hand, not right away. He spoke to her softly. He said that for 1,000 years her clan had taught her to kill those like him by the rules. But he doesn't play by the rules. And if she wants to learn how to fight for real, she can come. No sermons. Seraphine looked up at him. A necromancer, a desecrator, the one she was supposed to destroy. He stood before her, holding out his hand. She slowly raised her palm and took his wrist. He lifted her to her feet. Let go. Turned and walked away from the arena. The hall was silent. Cassius Vane sat in the stands, his face pale. Helga Frost watched Kell walk away, and for the first time, her gray eyes weren't icy. There was something else in them, something she didn't yet know the name of. Professor Leora sat in the box, feverishly writing in her notebook. She crossed out another page of her textbook and jotted in the margins that it was impossible, but he had done it. For the third time in 2 weeks. At the arena exit, Kell stopped. A girl was standing by the wall. Small, skinny, with short black hair and big dark eyes. Her clothes were no better than his had been on the day he arrived. Worn out, patched up, poor. She looked at him and didn't smile, but in her eyes there was neither fear nor contempt nor admiration. There was recognition. She was from the same slums. Kell stopped. He looked at her. She said her name was Mira. She said she'd been assigned to the trash class too, and that she'd seen everything and understood. Kell nodded. He didn't say a word. But for the first time since he'd been at the academy, his face softened slightly. Someone understood. Not because he was smart or strong, but because he was one of them. After the duel with Seraphine, the academy split. The fault line ran through every class and every corridor. On one side stood those who believed in the canons, the heirs of great houses, top students with the right builds, professors who had been teaching the same truths for 20 years. To them, Kell was a mistake, an anomaly, a disease that had to be cut out before it spread. On the other side were those who remained silent, the quiet ones, the inconspicuous ones, students with poor grades, with mediocre stats, with builds that the canons called hopeless. They didn't speak of it aloud, but they looked at Kell with different eyes, with hope, small and cautious, like a candle flame in a draft. Kell didn't notice either the first or the second group. He trained, every day, every night. Up at 4 a.m, striking the pillar, running across the rooftops, raising the undead in the basement. 3 skeletons had become stable. They lasted longer, moved with more confidence, obeyed more precisely. The 4th still crumbled after a minute, but a minute was already progress. 2 weeks ago, the 4th one didn't last a second. Kell paid for every skeleton with sweat and blood, literally. His nose bled after every resurrection. His head buzzed for hours. Proper necromancers raised a dozen dead with a snap of their fingers. Kell tore 3 out of the ground with his teeth. But they rose, and they obeyed. Not intellect, will. At the end of the 3rd week, Professor Garrick found him. Kell was pounding a steak in the backyard when he heard a cough behind him. He turned around. The old man was standing in the shadow of the wall, looking at him with an expression Kell couldn't read. Garrick said he wanted to talk. Kell replied that he was listening. They sat down on a stone bench by the wall. Garrick was silent for a full minute. Then he began to speak. He spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. He told him that 40 years ago he had been a young student at this academy. He had been assigned to the battle mage class. According to the canon, he was supposed to level up his intelligence and long-range spells, but he wanted something different. He wanted to invest his points in dexterity and become a mobile melee battle mage. He tried it. He was noticed a week later. He was summoned to the rector. The rector, at the time, was the grandfather of the current Aldrich. They explained to him that his build was heresy. They gave him a choice: redistribute his points according to the canon or be expelled. Garrick redistributed them. He spent 40 years teaching the history of magic and hating every second of it, because he knew the canons are a cage, not the law, not the truth, a cage. And now he was looking at the boy who had done what he hadn't dared to do. Garrick said he couldn't help openly. The rector is watching. Professors are reported, but he could offer hints, guide, warn of pitfalls. Kell looked at the old man, at the scar across his brow, at the graying temples, at the eyes that held the pain of 4 decades. Kell nodded. A single movement of the head, without words. Garrick understood. Their conversation lasted 5 minutes, but in those 5 minutes, Kell had gained his first ally within the system. The first month was drawing to a close. Kell had gained 2 more levels. The points had taken effect. His strikes now left dents in the iron training shields. His speed allowed him to dodge 2 attacks at once. In combat training classes, he was paired for sparring with the strongest students. The professor of combat tactics hoped that someone would finally put the Necromancer in his place. No one could. A second-rank swordsman lasted 30 seconds. An elemental mage, 18. A spearman from a military family, 22. Kell knocked them out one after another. Sometimes with his fist. Sometimes with his elbow. Sometimes he'd just grab them and throw them to the ground so hard it knocked the wind out of them. His skeletons tied up the opponent for the first few seconds, tripped them up, grabbed their arms, distracted them, and then Kell would come, and it would all be over. Quickly, brutally, without any wasted motion. Professor Leora kept track of his victories in a notebook. 12 sparring matches, 12 wins, 0 losses. Average fight time, 19 seconds. She had already filled 3 notebooks with notes on his style. Every page was covered in notes and crossouts. Half of her monograph on proper builds lay in the trash can. She couldn't explain what she saw, but she couldn't stop watching. By the start of the 2nd month, news reached the Vane clan. Cassius received a letter from his father. The clan head was furious. His son, the top student in his class, heir to the greatest fighting house, had ceded the top spot in the rankings to a necromancer from the slums. It was unacceptable. It was a disgrace. The letter was brief. Take back first place, at any cost. Cassius read the letter and clenched it in his fist. The paper crumpled. His face went stiff. He knew what he had to do. But he also knew something else. He had seen Kell fight. He had seen the speed of those strikes. He had seen swordsmen and mages fall one after another. And for the first time in his life, the heir to the Vane clan was not certain of his victory. Cassius went to the other 2 heirs of the fighting clans. Dorian Ashwell, class Berserker, broad as a wardrobe with arms as thick as logs. His family was renowned for brute strength and unbreakable resilience, 3rd in the class rankings. Rowan Kell, battle mage class, tall and thin with sharp features and cold green eyes. His family owned the largest magical library on the continent, second in the class rankings before Kell turned everything upside down. The three heirs met in an empty training hall. Cassius laid out the plan, not one-on-one, together, 3 against 1, in an official sparring match. According to High March rules, group combat was permitted if all parties consented. Cassius was certain Kell would agree. Street fighters don't back down from a fight. It's beneath their dignity. Dorian smirked and clenched his fists. Rowan nodded silently. The Golden Trio. 3 heirs of the 3 strongest fighting clans. 3 perfect canonical builds. Against a single necromancer with 0 intelligence and fists. The next morning, Cassius approached Kell in the hallway. A crowd gathered instantly. Cassius spoke loudly so everyone could hear. He said that a one-on-one fight with the Necromancer would be unfair. To the Necromancer. That's why he was proposing a fair fight. 3 against 1. The continent's 3 best canonical builds against 1 broken one. If Kell won, Cassius would admit that the canons could be wrong. If he lost, he would leave the academy voluntarily. Kell looked at Cassius, then at Dorian over his left shoulder, then at Rowan over his right. 3 heirs, 3 names known across the continent, against an orphan from the slums. Kell brushed the dust from his knuckles. He said one word. He said he agreed. The crowd in the hallway roared. Helga Frost stood against the wall, her fingers clenched around the hilt of the sword at her belt. She didn't know who she wanted to root for. Seraphine Aldermont stood a little way off. Her hand involuntarily touched the spot on her solar plexus where Kell's blow had landed 2 weeks ago. The bruise had long since faded, but she could still feel it. Mira stood at the very end of the hallway, small and inconspicuous. Her dark eyes were calm. She wasn't worried. She knew. Out on the street, 3 against 1 was just another Tuesday. The fight was scheduled for the 3rd day. 3 days of waiting had turned the academy into a beehive. The students talked of nothing else. The Golden Trio against the Necromancer. 3 perfect builds against 1 broken one. Bets were placed openly right in the dining hall. 9 out of 10 bet on the trio. 1 in 10 bet on Kell. That one was usually someone the canons also kept at the bottom. Kell spent those 3 days as usual. Training, lectures, training, raising the undead, sleep. He didn't change a single element of his routine. He wasn't nervous. He didn't prepare a strategy. He didn't ask for advice. He just hit the pole and raised skeletons. Garrick found him the night before the fight. The old man said that Dorian Ashwell was a berserker and that his style was pressure. He charges forward and doesn't stop. Every missed blow makes him stronger. His body absorbs the pain and turns it into rage. The longer the fight, the more dangerous he becomes. Garrick said that Rowan Kell is a ranged battle mage. He strikes from a distance. Fire arrows, ice spears, air blades. He doesn't let anyone get close and methodically dismantles his opponent from afar. The perfect canonical build. And Cassius, a knight, sword and shield, defense and counterattack. He waits for a mistake and punishes it, patient, calculating, the most dangerous of the 3. Garrick said that individually, each of them is inferior to Kell, but together they cover each other's weaknesses. The berserker presses the attack, the mage casts spells, the knight finishes them off. Classic tactics of a combat trio, refined over centuries, enshrined in the canon. Kell listened. He nodded. Garrick asked if he had a plan. Kell replied that he did. Garrick asked what it was. Kell replied that he was going to take them out. Garrick sighed. The day of the battle, the arena was packed to the brim. Not just the freshmen. The upperclassmen had come, the alumni had come. Half the faculty sat in the box seats. Rector Aldrich Highmarch stood at the railing, looking down at the arena from above. His face was carved from stone. Seraphine sat in the 3rd row of the stands. Her hands lay on her knees, clenched into fists. She didn't understand what she was feeling. 2 weeks ago, this man had knocked her down with a single blow. She should have wanted him crushed, but she didn't. and that frightened her more than any fight. Helga Frost sat as straight as a blade. Her notebook lay on her lap. It contained calculations, Kell's speed, the force of his strike, reaction time, attack distance. She had been analyzing him for 3 weeks, every sparring session, every movement. According to her calculations, he didn't stand a chance. 3 against 1 with opponents like these was a mathematical defeat. But something inside her didn't believe her own calculations. Professor Leora sat in the box and chewed on a pencil. Her 4th notebook was open to the first page. She had written the date and the words "triple battle" at the top, and underlined it 3 times. Mira sat at the very top, alone, quiet, calm. She looked at the arena and waited. The 3 heirs entered first. Cassius in the center, full vein family armor, blue steel with gold engravings, a sword in his right hand, a shield in his left. Dorian on the left, no armor, a bare torso woven with muscles like ropes, a 2-handed axe on his back. A berserker doesn't wear armor. Armor hinders fury. Rowan on the right, a battle mage's long robe. His hands were already glowing with a pale fire. He began charging spells before the signal. According to the rules, this was allowed. A gust of wind from his magic swept across the arena. Kell came out last. Unarmed, unarmored, rags on his hands, a shirt with rolled-up sleeves, pants with patches, boots from the slums. He looked like a vagrant who had wandered into a knight's tournament. The hall fell silent. The signal. Rowan struck first. 3 fiery arrows flew across the arena. Kell darted to the right. The arrows struck the sand and exploded in fountains of flame. Dorian was already running. The axe spun above his head. His eyes turned red. Berserker rage. With every step, he grew faster and heavier. Kell stamped his foot on the ground. 3 skeletons rose from the sand. He sent them at Dorian. The skeletons clung to the berserker. One grabbed his leg. Another grabbed his axe-wielding arm. The third leaped onto his back. Dorian roared and swung his axe. 2 skeletons were blown to pieces. The third held on. But the berserker was held back for 5 seconds. 5 seconds felt like an eternity. Kell was already running, not toward Dorian, toward Rowan. A ranged mage is dangerous from a distance. Up close, he's nothing. Rowan saw the necromancer running toward him, and his eyes widened. He fired an icy spear. Kell ducked as he ran. The spear whistled over his head and shattered against the arena wall. Rowan began to form a shield. He didn't make it in time. Kell reached him in 3 seconds. The first blow landed in the stomach. Rowan doubled over. A second blow to the back of his head knocked him onto the sand. The mage collapsed and didn't get up. 4 seconds. One of the 3 was down. The arena gasped. Cassius reacted instantly. He had been waiting for exactly this. His shield shot forward and slammed into Kell's side. The blow was precise and powerful. Kell flew 3 meters and rolled across the sand. His ribs flared with pain. Cassius didn't let him get up. The sword traced an arc. Kell rolled over. The blade sliced off a strand of hair. Another blow, another roll. Cassius pressed the attack methodically and coldly, a knight's style, controlling the distance, applying pressure, waiting for a mistake. Dorian finally shook off the last skeleton and ran across the arena. Axe in hand, his eyes burned scarlet. The berserker's fury was building. 2 against 1, knight and berserker, sword and axe, control and chaos. Kell was pinned. Cassius pressed from the front. Dorian charged from the side. Kell did what no one expected. He didn't jump away from Dorian. He jumped toward him, straight into the axe. At the last second, he dove under the blade. The axe passed a centimeter above his back. Kell found himself inside the berserker's guard, where the axe was useless, too close for a swing. A blow from below to the chin. Dorian's head jerked upward. His eyes rolled back. 220 pounds of muscle collapsed onto the sand like a felled tree. The arena roared. No, the arena didn't roar. The arena fell silent, because what they were seeing was impossible. The Necromancer had just knocked out a berserker in close combat, with a punch, against the class designed for close combat. He was alone. Cassius Vane stood in the center of the arena. His allies lay on the ground. His plan had fallen apart. He was alone, against a necromancer who didn't know the meaning of the word impossible. Cassius raised his sword. His hands didn't tremble. He was a knight, the heir, the best build of the best. He wouldn't give up. Kell looked at him. Blood flowed from his split eyebrow. His ribs ached from the blow with the shield. His knuckles were broken. He stepped forward. Cassius attacked. A series of sword strikes, fast, technical, perfect, by the book. Kell dodged. He retreated. He caught the rhythm. On the street, you learn to read your opponent in seconds. Not by the book, by the eyes, by the shoulders, by the breath. Cassius lowered his shield slightly after the third strike, for half a second. Kell saw it. With his left hand, he knocked the sword aside. His right fist came down like a hammer, a blow to the jaw. Cassius's helmet clanged. His head snapped back. His knees buckled. He fell. Silence. 3 bodies on the sand, 1 standing. Kell was breathing heavily. Blood dripped from his knuckles onto the sand. He stood alone among the 3 defeated heirs and said nothing. The arena was silent. The professors were silent. Rector Aldrich Highmarch stood at the railing, his fingers white with the force of his grip. He had just seen millennia-old cannons crack at the seams. After the fight with the trio, Kell's life had changed. He hadn't wanted it to, but the world hadn't asked. His name had spread beyond the academy walls. Rumors had spread across the continent like water through cracks. A necromancer from the slums. Knocks out knights with his fists. Beat 3 heirs at once. 0 intellect. Pure power. Breaks all the rules. To some, it was an amusing story. To others, a cause for rage. To still others, hope. The first 2 months at Highmarch were over, and Kell stood at the top of the class rankings. A necromancer. In first place. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Not once in the entire history of the academy. The professors didn't know how to react. Half wanted to study him. Half wanted to destroy him. Leora belonged to the first half. She began to follow Kell like a shadow. She showed up at every sparring match with a notebook in her hands. She tallied the statistics of his strikes. She timed how long it took to raise the undead. She recorded every detail of every fight. Her monograph lay in ruins, but a new theory was rising from the ruins. Not yet formulated, not yet named, but alive and pulsing like a heart. Leora approached Kell after another sparring session. She spoke quickly, almost choking on her words. She said that, according to all the models she knew, his necromancy shouldn't work. 0 intelligence means 0 control over the undead. It's an axiom. It's a law. But his skeletons obey. They move purposefully. They carry out tactical orders. She asked how. Kell looked at her, small, disheveled, with ink stains on her fingers and a mad gleam in her eyes. 22 years old, a genius, the author of the textbook he had disproved by his very existence. He said he didn't know how. He simply gave the order and they rose. Leora fell silent. Then she took out a notebook and began writing so fast that the pencil squeaked against the paper. She muttered a single word. Will. Kell shrugged and walked away. Leora stood there for another 10 minutes, writing. Then she ran to the library. Helga Frost watched the scene from behind a column. Her face was inscrutable. But her notebook was also full of notes. Only hers were different. Not scientific. Tactical. She analyzed every one of Kell's fights as a military operation. Reaction time, angles of attack, striking distance, evasion patterns. She was looking for a weakness, a system, a formula, a way to win. And she couldn't find it. It was driving her crazy. Helga was used to the world being analyzable, that any opponent could be broken down into components, that perfect technique defeats brute force. Kell shattered that confidence with every fight. His style was dirty, unpredictable, streetwise. There wasn't a single canonical move in it, not a single textbook stance. He fought like an animal, like a survivor, like someone who'd been beaten in alleyways since childhood and had learned to fight back. Helga closed her notebook. She'd made up her mind. The next day, she approached Kell, directly, without warning. She stood before him and looked him in the eyes. Kell stopped. He waited. Helga said she wanted to train with him. Not to fight, to train. She wanted to understand his style. Kell was silent for 3 seconds. Then he asked why. Helga replied that it was because she couldn't figure him out. And this was the first time in her life she couldn't figure out an opponent. Kell looked at her. The Ice Queen. Perfect build, perfect technique, perfect posture. Everything was so perfect it made him sick. He nodded. Helga blinked. She hadn't expected it to be this easy. From that day on, Helga Frost came to the backyard every morning. She watched as Kell struck the pole. She sparred with him. She lost. Every time. Her perfect sword-fighting technique shattered against his chaotic street style like a wave against a rock. She analyzed. She tried again. She lost. It should have made her angry. But instead of anger, she felt something strange. Something like excitement. For the first time in her life, she had encountered a challenge she couldn't solve. And it was exhilarating. Meanwhile, outside the academy walls, dark clouds were gathering. The great warrior houses were furious. The House of Vane, the House of Ashwell, the House of Kell. Their heirs had been humiliated, publicly, before the eyes of hundreds of witnesses. This wasn't just a loss in a sparring match. It was a blow to the reputation of houses they had built over centuries. The House of Vane sent an official protest to the Academy. They demanded an audit of Kell's build and the forced redistribution of his points according to the canon. Rector Aldrich received this letter and sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the Vane family seal. He knew that the Vane were not the only ones behind this letter. Behind them stood dozens of families. Behind them stood the Church of Order. Behind them stood the conclave of magisters, and they all wanted one thing: for the necromancer from the slums to know his place. Aldrich wrote a reply, polite, restrained. He stated that the system did not prohibit the free allocation of points, and that the Academy had no authority to force a student to reallocate them. He wrote the truth, and he hated every word he wrote. Because Aldrich Highmarch believed in the canons with all his heart. He believed that proper builds were order, that order is stability, that stability is peace. And Kell, by his very existence, threatened that peace. Aldrich didn't want to destroy the boy. He wanted to tame him, to show him that the canons exist not to oppress, but to protect. But the boy wouldn't listen. The boy smashed pillars and broke airs, and every day the number of those who looked to him with hope grew. By the 3rd month at the Academy, Seraphine Aldermont had stopped avoiding Kell. She didn't skip practice like Helga. She didn't stalk him with a notebook like Leora. She simply stopped walking away when he appeared. She sat 2 tables away from him in the dining hall. She stood 10 paces away on the stands. She was silent. She watched. Her hatred hadn't disappeared, but something else had settled in alongside the hatred. A question. Quiet and persistent. How does he do it? Not physically, not technically. How dare he? How dare he ignore everything the whole world believes in and still win? She had been raised on the canon. The canon was her air, her support, her faith. Kell knocked that support out from under her with a single punch, and she was falling, slowly, not knowing where she would land.
Mira came to see Kell every evening. They sat on a stone bench by the back wall and were silent. Sometimes she talked about her day, about the classes she struggled with, about the students who looked right through her, about her trashy class that she hated. Kell listened. He didn't comfort her, didn't cheer her up, didn't say everything would be okay. He just sat there beside her. And for Mira, that was enough.
She knew that in this world full of heirs and geniuses and canons, there was a person right beside her who understood, because he too had been a nobody and had become the one the whole world fears. The third month at High March brought a tournament, the Academy's biannual tournament, a tradition as old as the walls themselves. Every student is required to participate. The fights were single elimination. The winner received the title of strongest student and access to the restricted section of the library where ancient texts about the system were kept. For the heirs of great houses, the tournament was a chance to shine. For Kell, it was just another day. The draw took place in the morning. Kell was assigned number 13. Superstitious students began to whisper. 13. A cursed number for a cursed class. Kell didn't notice. The first matches were quick. Kell defeated 3 opponents in a total of 7 minutes. The first went down in 2 minutes, the second in 3. The third lasted 2.5, but only because he was running around the arena until Kell's skeletons cornered him. Kell stepped in and finished him with a single blow. The stands roared. The freshmen were already used to the way Kell fought, but for the upperclassmen it was a spectacle. A necromancer in close combat. A necromancer without a staff. A necromancer who struck harder than knights. They'd heard the rumors. Now they saw it with their own eyes. Cassius Vane was also making his way through the tournament bracket. Silent. Gloomy. He defeated every opponent, but without his former brilliance. His blows were harder than necessary. His shield struck the fallen even after the fight was over. Anger boiled inside him like water in a sealed cauldron. Dorian Ashwell and Rowan Kell were eliminated in the quarterfinals. Dorian lost to a third-year swordsman who proved too fast for his berserker rage. Rowan lost to an elemental mage who surpassed him in spell power. The golden trio had fallen apart. Cassius was left alone. In the semifinals, Kell faced a student he didn't know, a fourth-year senior, spearman class, tall and wiry, with long arms and an even longer spear. His name was Theron Graves. He was quiet and didn't stand out, but he wasn't in his 4th year for no reason. The fight began differently. Theron didn't wait. He attacked instantly. The spear flashed like lightning. Kell barely dodged it. The blade sliced through his shirt and left a red streak across his ribs. First blood. Kell jumped back. He summoned the skeletons. 3 bony figures crawled out of the ground. Theron didn't waste time on the skeletons. He leaped over the first one. He knocked the second one down in midair with his spear. He landed and smashed the third one with the shaft. 3 seconds. 3 skeletons, all lying on the ground. Kell clenched his teeth. This one was different. This one was fast and experienced and wasn't afraid of the undead. Theron attacked again. A series of spear thrusts, stabbing, slashing, chopping. The spear's reach outstripped that of a fist. Kell couldn't close the distance. Every attempt to get closer ended with a stab in the shoulder or a scratch on the arm. Blood flowed from half a dozen small wounds. The arena fell silent. For the first time in 3 months, someone was giving Kell a real fight. Helga Frost leaned forward in the stands. Her eyes were ablaze. She was seeing what she'd been waiting for: vulnerability. Kell was strong in close combat, but the spearman kept his distance, and at that distance, fists were useless. It wasn't a matter of canon, it was a matter of geometry. Sir Aphine sat motionless. Her fingers dug into the edge of the bench. She caught herself holding her breath. Leora scribbled in her notebook. She was recording every movement of both fighters, every angle, every distance. Blood in the arena. Real blood, not training blood. Mira sat up above, her face pale. She knew Kell had fought in the streets with knives and sticks, but a 4th-year spearman wasn't a street brawl. Kell stopped. He stood in the center of the arena, breathing heavily. Blood dripped from his left forearm, from a cut above his eyebrow, from a gash in his ribs. Theron stood 5 meters away and waited. His spear stood between them like a wall. Kell closed his eyes for a second, just a second. Theron saw it and attacked. The spear flew forward, a straight thrust to the chest. Kell opened his eyes. His right hand shot up. He grabbed the spear with his bare hand. The shaft slammed into his palm with such force that it tore the skin down to the flesh. Blood spurted, but Kell held on. His fingers clamped around the shaft like a steel vice. Theron tried to pull the spear out. He couldn't. He tried again. Kell didn't let go. 8 points in strength, plus level points, plus a street-smart grip that doesn't know the word let go. Kell yanked the spear toward him.
Theron flew forward, lost his balance. Kell threw out his left fist, a punch to the cheekbone. Theron spun through the air and crashed into the sand. The spear remained in Kell's hand. He threw it to the ground. It clattered against the stone. Theron lay unconscious. The arena erupted, this time not with silence, with a scream. Not with applause, just a scream, because no one could believe what they had seen. The Necromancer had caught the spear with his bare hand, bloodied, torn, and he'd knocked out the 4th-year spearman. Kell stood in the arena, his right palm red with blood. He looked at her. Then he looked at the stands. Then he wrapped his hand in a rag and walked toward the exit. Cassius Vane was sitting in the stands. He had seen everything, and he knew that this man awaited him in the final. This impossible man. The final was scheduled for tomorrow. Cassius hadn't slept all night. He sat in his room, staring at the Vane family sword. 7 generations of his family had carried this sword. Every heir had won with it. Every heir had followed the canon, and every heir had been the best. For the first time, Cassius asked himself a question he had never asked before. He asked himself, what if the traditions were wrong? He pushed the thought away. It was heresy. It was a betrayal of his lineage and everything it had given him. He gripped the hilt of the sword. Tomorrow he would prove that the traditions were right. Or die trying. The tournament final. A day High March would remember forever. The arena was packed. Every seat was taken. People stood in the aisles, sat on the railings, hung from the columns. It wasn't just students who had come. Faculty from every department had come. Representatives of the houses had come. Observers from the capital had come. Rumors of a necromancer who fights harder than knights had reached the ears of those who usually pay no attention to student tournaments. In a separate box sat 2 men in dark robes with silver embroidery, the insignia of the Conclave of Magisters, observers. Rector Aldrich noticed them, and his face grew even stiffer. The Conclave had sent its people. This was bad. The Conclave doesn't come just to watch. The Conclave comes when it sees a threat. Cassius Vane stepped into the arena in full family armor. The blue steel gleamed in the sun, a sword in his right hand, a shield in his left. There was no fear on his face, no doubt. The night had passed. Doubts remained in the darkness. Morning brought clarity. He was a knight, the heir, the best. He would prove it. Kell stepped out as usual, unarmed, without armor, rags on his hands. His right palm still stung from yesterday's wound. He cracked his neck, shrugged his shoulders, looked at Cassius. Cassius looked at him. 2 seconds of silence. Then Cassius spoke, loudly, so the arena could hear. He said that Kell was a necromancer. That by all laws of magic, a necromancer is bound to lose to a knight in close combat. That this is the law. That this is the canon. That this is a truth forged over millennia. Kell didn't answer. He simply stepped into the arena. The signal. Cassius didn't wait. He attacked first. The sword traced an arc from bottom to top. Kell flinched. Cassius's shield followed. A blow from the edge of the shield to the shoulder. Kell took the blow and held his ground. His feet were rooted in the sand. Cassius pressed on. He was different today. Not the cold, calculating knight.
not the cautious, counter-attacking fighter. He fought with a fury he had been building up for months, with the fury of an heir who had been put in his place, with the fury of a man who fears that everything he believed in is a lie. The sword whistled. The shield clanged. Cassius wouldn't let Kell summon the skeletons. Every time Kell tried to stomp the ground, Cassius attacked and forced him to dodge. He had learned from the mistakes of the last fight. He didn't let the undead enter the fray. Kell fought without skeletons, one-on-one, fists against steel. It was brutal, unfair, and it was exactly what Cassius wanted, to show that without the undead, a necromancer is nothing. By the book. Kell took a sword blow to the forearm. The blade sliced through the cloth and the skin beneath it. Blood trickled down his arm. He took another one, to the thigh, shallow but painful. The arena watched as the necromancer bled out. Mira in the upper rows clenched her fists so hard her nails dug into her palms. Her face was white. Seraphine watched without blinking. Every sword strike against Kell's body echoed in her, as if she were being struck herself. She didn't understand why. Helga was counting. Wounds, blood loss, duration of the fight. By her calculations, Kell could hold out for another 3 minutes. Then his body would fail. Leora wasn't writing. She was just watching. The pencil in her fingers snapped in half. She didn't notice. Kell was retreating. Cassius was pressing forward. The sword sliced through air and flesh. The shield struck like a battering ram. Knight against necromancer. Canon against heresy. Everything was going by the book. Kell was bound to lose. It was written. It had to be. Kell stopped. In the middle of the arena, in a pool of his own blood. He stopped retreating. Cassius saw it and struck. The sword came horizontally, at the head. Kell dove under the blade, not backward, forward, into the defense. His forehead slammed into Cassius's face, a headbutt, dirty, street style, banned in every textbook. Cassius staggered back. Blood gushed from his nose. The shield dropped for a second. Kell struck with his left, to the torso, under the shield, at the seam of the armor where the steel is thinner. Cassius doubled over. Kell struck with his right, to the jaw, under the visor. The fist struck like a hammer. Cassius's helmet crumpled from the blow. His head snapped back. His eyes went blank. His legs buckled. He fell slowly, like a tower collapsing. First he swayed, then he leaned, then he collapsed. The sword clanged against the arena stones. The shield fell nearby. Cassius Vane lay on his back, staring at the sky with empty eyes. He was conscious, but he couldn't move. His body had given out. One blow, the final blow, the decisive one. The arena was silent. Not the silence that had followed the first sparring match. That had been shock. This was different. This was the silence of understanding, the realization that the world had just changed. Kell stood over Cassius. Blood flowed from 7 wounds. His hands trembled. His breathing was ragged. He had won. But he had paid with blood for every second of that fight. He raised his head and looked at the stands, at the hundreds of faces, at the professors, at the observers in the dark robes of the conclave, at Rector Aldrich, whose face had turned gray. Kell didn't make any grand speeches. He just stood there, drenched in his own blood. A necromancer, in first place, the tournament winner, living proof that the canons lie. Professor Leora stood in the box. Her chair fell. She didn't notice. She was looking at Kell, and her eyes were filled with tears. Not pity, shock. Everything she knew, everything she had written, everything she had taught, was a lie. And the truth stood in the arena, covered in blood and with shattered fists. Helga Frost sat motionless. Her notebook was closed. Calculations no longer mattered. She looked at Kell, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't analyzing. She just watched, like a human, not like a tactician. Seraphine was crying, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She didn't understand why she was crying, not out of pity for Cassius, not out of fear for Kell, out of something greater. From the realization that the entire world she had grown up in was built on lies. Mira wasn't crying. She was smiling. A small, quiet smile from a girl of the streets who had seen her own man win. The conclave observers exchanged glances. One of them pulled out a communication crystal and activated it. He sent a message to the capital, a short one, 3 words. Heresy confirmed. Let's begin. After the tournament, Kell spent 3 days in the infirmary. 7 wounds, a lacerated forearm, a cut on his thigh, 4 deep gashes on his torso. His right palm scraped down to the flesh. The academy healer was elderly and taciturn. She treated the wounds in silence, applied ointments, bandaged them, and said only one thing. She said he was either the bravest person she'd ever met or the craziest. Kell replied that usually it was one and the same. On the second day, Mira came to the infirmary. She brought apples, real ones, not from the cafeteria. She had found them somewhere outside the academy walls. Kell took one and took a bite. They sat in silence, Mira on a chair nearby, Kell on the bed. The silence was warm, not empty. There was no need to build a conversation on it. It simply was. Mira said she wanted him to teach her to allocate points outside the canon, to teach her to fight, to teach her to be something more than the trash class the system had awarded her. Kell looked at her. Thin, small, dark eyes in which the same thing burned as in his own. Anger. Not blind. Cold. Precise. The anger of someone who'd been told their whole life that they were worthless. Kell nodded. On the third day, Helga arrived. She entered the infirmary as if it were a command tent. Back straight, her step was precise. She stood by the bed and placed her notebook on the nightstand. Open. Kell looked at the pages. They were filled with calculations of his fighting style, graphs, diagrams, formulas. Helga said she had spent 3 months analyzing his technique. For 3 months, she had tried to find the formula for his victories. And she found it. The formula was simple. It didn't exist. There was no formula. There was no system. There was no pattern. He fought on instinct. Pure animal instinct for survival that couldn't be calculated because he himself didn't know what he would do in the next second. And that drove Helga crazy. Because she couldn't figure it out. Because for the first time in her life, a perfect system had lost to chaos. She said she wanted to understand, not to analyze, to understand how a person lives without rules, how they think, how they breathe. She said this, and her icy eyes flinched slightly, for a single moment. Kell looked at her and didn't understand. He grew up on the streets. There, girls didn't come up to you with notebooks and say they wanted to understand you. Out there, girls generally stayed away from those who fought. He nodded awkwardly. Helga took her notebook and left. Her step was slightly less steady than usual. On the 4th day, Kell left the infirmary. A changed world awaited him. The students looked at him differently. Not with contempt, not with mockery, not even with admiration, with something greater, with a question. If a necromancer can be the strongest, then what can I do? That question burned in the eyes of every other student at High March, especially in those whom the canons kept at the bottom. The boy in the alchemist class who had always dreamed of close combat. The girl summoner who had to fight herself instead of hiding behind monsters. A healer guy who was sickened by the thought that he'd spend his whole life standing in the back, patching up other people's wounds. They came, one by one, in pairs, quietly, unnoticed. They stood in the backyard and watched as Kell struck the post. They didn't leave. They waited. Kell noticed them on the 5th day. 7 of them. standing by the wall and watching. He stopped. He looked at them. They looked back. There was one question in their eyes. Teach us. Kell wiped the sweat from his forehead. He had no intention of becoming a teacher. He didn't know how to teach. He knew how to fight. But he looked at those 7 and saw himself. A month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. Those whom the world had written off. Those whom the canons had called weak. Those who were told to know their place. He nodded. They came the next morning, and the next. Mira was among them, the first student. Kell didn't lecture, he demonstrated. He struck the post. He showed them how to stand, how to move, how to put weight into a strike. Then he told them one thing. Forget what's written in the canons. Open the system, look at your stats, and put your points where you want them, not where the textbooks tell you to, where your gut tells you to. The alchemist put his points into speed. In the next sparring match, he moved like a shadow, and his opponent couldn't figure out where the blows were coming from. The summoner put hers into strength. She summoned her guardian spirit and stood beside it in battle, 2 fighters instead of 1. The healer invested in endurance and willpower. He stopped hiding. He stepped forward. His healing hands proved deadly in close combat. Every touch could heal or destroy. He didn't know this. The canons hadn't told him, because the canons didn't want him to know. 7 students became 10. 10 became 15. The movement grew, quietly, in the shadows, away from the eyes of the professors and the heirs. Garrick helped. He warned them when the professors planned inspections. He pointed out safe places for training. He gave Kell fragments of ancient knowledge he found in closed archives, knowledge that wasn't in the textbooks, because someone had removed it from there a very long time ago. Leora showed up too, but not as a teacher, as an observer. She sat in the corner with a notebook and recorded every violation of the canon. Every instance where an incorrect distribution of points yielded a result that the correct one could not. Her new theory was gaining evidence. The system imposes no limits. The system is free. Canons are artificial frameworks imposed by someone, once upon a time, for some reason. She didn't yet know by whom or why, but she knew the frameworks were false, and every day in Kell's group confirmed it. Rector Aldrich received another letter, this time not from the Order, from the Church of Order. The chief hierarch wrote that information had reached him about an academy student who was distorting the sacred canons of distribution and sowing heresy among young minds. The church demanded immediate action. Aldrich placed the letter on the table and stared out the window for a long time. Outside, students were heading to class. An ordinary day, an ordinary life. But beneath this ordinariness, something was changing. Something was cracking. Something was shifting. And Aldrich knew there was only one way to stop it. Eliminate the source. Eliminate Kell. But how could he eliminate the Academy's strongest student, who had not broken a single rule of the system? Formally, there was no reason to expel him. Formally, he was beyond reproach. But informally, he was destroying the world. Aldrich clenched his jaw. He summoned his secretary and ordered an invitation to be sent to the Conclave of Magisters. If the Academy cannot deal with heresy, the Conclave will. That same evening, Kell sat on a stone bench. Mira sat next to him. A little further away, Helga stood pretending to examine a blade. Even further away, Seraphine leaned against the wall and said nothing. She came every evening now, silently, without explanation. She just stood nearby. 4 people surrounding an orphan from the slums. The 3 strongest girls in the academy and 1 girl from the streets. Kell didn't understand what was happening. On the street, the only people near you were those who wanted something from you. Food, protection, advantage. These 4 asked for nothing. They were simply there. And that was the most baffling thing of all that had happened to him in High March. He'd grown up alone. He'd fought alone. He'd survived alone. For the first time in his life, there were people nearby who didn't leave. He didn't know what to do with it, so he just sat there and said nothing. and around him, a storm was slowly but surely gathering. The conclave arrived a week later. 3 masters in dark robes with silver embroidery. They entered the gates of Highmarch as masters, not as guests. Rector Aldrich met them personally. He led them into the closed wing of the academy, to a place where students were not allowed. Their names were learned later: Master Varath, Master Celine, Master Draven. 3 guardians of the canons. 3 pillars of an order 1,000 years old. Each of them was at a level no Highmarch professor had ever reached. Their power was canonical, perfect, honed over centuries. They were living proof that the right builds work. Or so it seemed. Garrick warned Kell that same evening. The old man came out to the backyard, his face ashen. He said the conclave wasn't here to observe. It was here to solve a problem. And the problem was Kell. Garrick said that in his youth, he'd heard stories about how the conclave solved problems. People disappeared, quietly, without a trace. An accident during training, a spell gone wrong, a dungeon collapse. There's always an explanation. There's always a reason. And after that, the heresy always stops. Kell listened. His expression didn't change. He asked what exactly the conclave was protecting. What was so important in the canons that people would kill for them? Garrick fell silent for a long time.
Then he said he didn't know, but he knew where to look for the answer. The restricted section of the library. The very one Kell had gained access to as the tournament winner. There were texts there that were 1,000 years old, texts that no one had read since the conclave established the canons. Kell went to the library that very night, past the sleeping corridors, past the dozing guards. The restricted section was behind a heavy door of black wood. His winner's token unlocked the lock. Inside, it was dark and dusty. The shelves stretched into darkness. The books stood so close together that no air passed between them. Kell lit an oil lamp and began to search. He searched for 3 hours. He couldn't read quickly. The slums don't teach speed reading. But he knew how to search, patiently, methodically, like searching for food in garbage heaps, going through everything until you find what you need. He found it on the bottom shelf in the far corner, a thin scroll, yellowed with age.
The seal on it had been broken a very long time ago. Kell unrolled it and began to read. He read slowly, syllable by syllable. The ancient language was similar to the modern one, but heavier, thicker. It took him an hour to make out the text, and what he read turned everything upside down. 1,000 years ago, there lived a mage. His name had been erased from the scroll. Someone had scraped it off with a knife. This mage was the first to realize that the system was free. He distributed points as he pleased. He leveled up whatever he deemed necessary. He broke every build that existed. He became stronger than any warrior, any mage, any assassin. He combined classes that were canonically incompatible. He proved that magic depends not on stats, but on will. And he became so powerful that he challenged the very founders of the magical order. He nearly won, almost. He was stopped at the cost of thousands of lives.
After his fall, the surviving magisters gathered and decided that such a thing must never happen again. They created the canons, sacred rules for distributing points. They declared that every class has a single correct path of development. They erased the memory that the system is free. They rewrote the textbooks. They rewrote history. They erased the name of the mage who proved freedom. And for 1,000 years, they kept the world caged within the confines of correct builds. Not out of wisdom, out of fear. Because a free mage is unpredictable. A free mage is uncontrollable. A free mage is dangerous. But an obedient mage with a canonical build is a tool, controllable, predictable, safe, for those at the top. Kell sat on the library floor holding the scroll. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from anger. For 1,000 years, an entire continent had lived in a cage. For 1,000 years, people had been told they could only be what they were permitted to be. For 1,000 years, those who tried to step outside the boundaries had been suppressed. Like Garrick.
like hundreds of others who had been broken and silenced. And all of this for the sake of control. All of this for the sake of the power of those at the top. Kell rolled up the scroll and hid it under his shirt. He left the library. They were waiting for him in the hallway. 2 of them, not students. Men in dark clothes without insignia. Their faces were hidden. They moved silently, professionally. The first one attacked without warning. A knife flashed in the darkness. Kell flinched. The blade passed a millimeter from his throat. The second came up from behind. A noose. A thin wire darted toward his neck. Kell crouched and rolled. The wire whistled over his head. The hallway was narrow, dark. 2 against 1, knives and nooses. This wasn't a duel. It was an assassination attempt. Kell kicked the floor. 1 skeleton. He couldn't manage more. His head was splitting. But 1 was enough. The skeleton clung to the first killer's legs. The man stumbled. Kell finished him off with an elbow to the temple. The second one took off running. Kell caught up to him in 3 leaps, grabbed him by the collar, slammed him into the wall. The assassin went limp. Kell stood in the dark corridor, breathing heavily. 2 bodies on the floor, the scroll under his shirt, the truth in his hands. The conclave had tried to kill him, quietly, without a trace, just as Garrick had said, an accident. But the accident didn't happen, because a necromancer from the slums was used to surviving. Kell didn't sleep until morning. He sat in the backyard and thought. The scroll lay in a hiding place under a stone slab. The 2 assassins lay bound in the basement of the abandoned wing. Someone would find them, but not right away. At dawn, Mira came. She saw his face and sat down beside him without a word. Then Helga came. She noticed the cut on Kell's neck, a thin one, red. One that had nearly been fatal. Her eyes narrowed. She asked who had done it. Kell told her. Everything. The scroll, the assassination attempt, the truth about the canons. He spoke quietly and evenly, without anger, without drama. Facts. Bare facts. When he finished, Helga was silent for a long time. Then her face changed. The ice in her eyes cracked. Beneath it was a flame. She said she had devoted her entire life to the canons, that she had built herself according to rules that turned out to be a cage, that every one of her ideal traits, every one of her honed skills, every one of her flawless techniques was a chain she had voluntarily placed upon herself, and she had been lied to her whole life. Mira said nothing. She already knew. On the streets, you learn early on that the rules are written by those who stand to gain. She didn't need a scroll to understand that. By noon, Kell had gathered everyone. Garrick, Leora, Helga, Seraphine, Mira. 15 students. They met in the basement of the abandoned wing. 22 people in a dark stone hall. Kell held up the scroll. Leora read it aloud. Her voice trembled. Every word struck like a hammer. Every sentence brought down walls that had stood for 1,000 years. When she finished, the hall was silent. Garrick sat with his eyes closed. A tear ran down his cheek. 40 years. For 40 years he had known that the canons were lies, but he didn't know why. Now he knew. Seraphine stood against the wall. Her face was pale. The House of Aldermont, paladins, undead hunters. For 1,000 years, her family had served an order that turned out to be a prison. For 1,000 years, they had killed those who tried to break free. Necromancers, heretics, the free. They were jailers and didn't know it. Seraphine pressed her palm to her face. She wasn't crying, she was burning, from the inside. Kell spoke. He said that in 2 months, the great tournament of the continent would take place. Morwyn's premier competition. The strongest fighters from all the academies would come there, heirs to great houses, the world's best canonical builds. The conclave would come there. Representatives of the church would come there. The entire continent will be watching. Kell said he would enter this tournament, and his students would enter with him. 15 fighters with impossible builds. A speed alchemist, a fighter summoner, a warrior healer, and a dozen more whom the canons had written off as trash. They would enter and win, in full view of the entire continent, in full view of the conclave, in full view of a 1,000-year-old lie. And when they win, Kell will show the scroll and tell the truth. The hall was silent. Then Garrick stood up. He said he was 60 years old and that he had been waiting for this moment for 40 of them. Leora stood up. She said she would rewrite her monograph, the real one, based on the truth, on the fact that the system is free. Helga stood up. She said that her sword now stood for freedom, not for the canon. Seraphine stood up last. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that her family had served a lie for 1,000 years, and that she would be the first Aldermont to serve the truth. Mira did not stand up. She sat and smiled, quietly, warmly. She had been with Kell from day one anyway. She didn't need to declare it. The next 2 months were hell. Kell trained his students every day, from dawn till dusk. He pushed them until they collapsed, lifted them up, and pushed them again. Each student pushed their canonical build further, deeper, more radically. The alchemist invested new points in perception and began to see an opponent's weak points a second before the strike. The summoner boosted her stamina and could fight for hours without tiring. The healer discovered that his healing energy, with sufficient willpower, was capable of destroying tissue instead of restoring it. Reverse healing, a deadly technique.
The canon forbade even thinking about it. Every violation of the canon granted new power. Every impossible build unlocked impossible techniques. The system rewarded them. Not the right path, the free path, independent thinking, personal choice. Leora documented everything. Her new monograph grew like a living being. The pages multiplied, the evidence piled up. She named it simply, the free system. The conclave did not remain idle. Master Varath personally toured the academy. He spoke with professors. He studied the rankings. He watched the sparring matches. He saw that Kell was training a group. He saw that the canons were cracking, but he could not act openly. The first assassination attempt had failed. 2 of his agents had disappeared. An open attack on a student within the academy walls was a scandal even the conclave could not afford. He waited. The tournament was approaching, and at the tournament, killing was legal. The continent's grand tournament was held every 3 years in the capital of Morwyn, the city of Ashenmere. A massive arena carved out of black rock, stands for 20,000 spectators, boxes for the aristocracy, a separate balcony for the conclave of magisters, a separate section for the Church of Order. The strongest from across the continent gathered here, heirs of warrior clans in gleaming armor, graduates of the finest academies, provincial champions, all with perfect canonical builds, all honed to perfection by rules that were 1,000 years old. The High March delegation arrived a day before the start. Kell led the way. Behind him were 15 students, all in simple clothes. No coats of arms, no family crests, no gleaming armor. They looked like a gang of ragged vagabonds who had wandered into a ball. Registration went off with a hitch. The tournament steward looked at the list of classes for the High March delegation and couldn't believe his eyes. A necromancer. An alchemist. A summoner. A healer. A bard. A craftsman. Classes that had never set foot in the arena of the grand tournament. Trash classes. Second rate. The ones the canons had banished to the back rows forever. The organizer asked if it was a mistake. Kell replied that it wasn't. The news spread through the tournament in an hour. High March had brought a team of heretics. A necromancer who fights with his fists. A healer who intends to fight. A melee alchemist. It sounded like a bad joke. Most of the participants laughed. Cassius Vane did not laugh. He had also come to the tournament, not from High March, from the House of Vane. His father had demanded that his son restore the family's honor in the continent's main arena. Cassius was ready. For 2 months, he trained with the fury of a man possessed. His build was even more canonical than before.
even more refined, even more perfect. He believed that the perfection of the canon would triumph over the chaos of heresy. He had to believe it, otherwise his whole life lost its meaning. The first day of the tournament, the group stage. 64 fighters divided into 16 groups, 4 in each. The top 2 advance. Kell's group. He faces a knight from Westhold Academy, an elemental mage from Thorngate Academy, against a spearman from the Ashwell family's personal retinue. 3 canonical builds, all perfect, all correct. Kell stepped into the Ashenmere arena. 20,000 spectators. The noise was so loud that the ground vibrated beneath his feet. The knight from Westhold went first. He was good, technical, trained, by the book. He lasted 40 seconds. Kell raised skeletons. 3 figures rose from the sand. The knight hacked at them and didn't notice Kell coming in from the side. A blow to the neck, under the helmet. The knight fell. The arena roared. 20,000 people saw what the rumors had been about. A necromancer striking in close combat. The elemental mage was second. He didn't repeat the mistake. He struck from a distance. Fireballs, ice spears, lightning. The arena turned into hell. Kell ran through the fire. Skeletons covered him. One took an ice spear in the body and crumbled. Another took a bolt of lightning and exploded into bone shrapnel. A third clung to the mage's leg. The mage looked down. Kell was already in front of him. A blow. The mage fell. The Ashwell spearman refused to fight. He had seen the 2 before him and did not want to be the third. The group was defeated. But Kell was not the only shock of the tournament. In other groups, his students were fighting, and they were tearing the world apart. The bespectacled alchemist darted past blows like a ghost. His opponents swung their swords at thin air. He touched them, and his alchemical reactions corroded their armor in seconds. 3 fights, 3 victories. The summoner called forth her guardian spirit and stood beside it. 2 fighters at once. She fought on equal footing with her own summon. Her opponent, a swordsman from the Southern Academy, didn't know where to strike. The healer faced off against the berserker. The berserker charged at him like a bull. The healer did not back down. He caught the berserker's blow on his forearm, and his healing energy entered the flesh. But it did not heal. It curled up. It flipped over. The berserker's muscles seized in a spasm. Reverse healing. The berserker collapsed and writhed in the sand. The hall gasped. The healer. The trash class. He'd just taken down a berserker with a single touch. A technique that doesn't exist in the canons. The conclave's box was silent. Master Verath stared at the arena, his face a mask. But his fingers were clenched so tightly on the armrest that the wood creaked. This was worse than he'd thought. Not just one heretic. 15, and each of them was breaking the canons in their own way. Each was proving that the system was free. Verath turned to Master Draven and said quietly that this had to be stopped before the finals, at any cost. Draven nodded. By the end of the first day, of the 16 Kell students, including himself, 13 had advanced past the group stage. 13 heretics in the grand tournament playoffs. The continent watched and couldn't believe its eyes. The second day of the tournament began with blood. Not in the arena, behind the scenes. 2 of Kell's students were found unconscious in the arena corridor the morning before the fights. An alchemist and a bard. Both beaten, both unable to stand. Both withdrawn from the tournament on medical grounds. No one saw the attackers. No one heard a thing. Kell stood over them and watched. His face was stony. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He knew who did it. The conclave. Quiet, clean, just as Garrick had said. Mira stood nearby. She was trembling, not from fear, from rage. Helga placed her hand on the hilt of her sword. Her eyes were ice, but beneath the ice burned a fire that made one want to step back. Seraphine was silent. Her fists were clenched. The golden light of holy magic flickered on her palms. Involuntarily, she wanted to find those who had done this. The House of Aldermont had served order for 1,000 years. Now order had shown its true face, and Seraphine realized she could no longer serve it. Kell had said one thing. He said they would continue. 11 heretics had advanced to the playoffs. Single elimination matches, quarterfinals, semifinals, finals. The arena roared. 20,000 spectators were waiting for blood. The quarterfinals were brutal. Kell's students fought like madmen. The summoner faced off against the champion of the western provinces, a swordsman with a perfect canonical build. He was older, more experienced, stronger on paper. She summoned her spirit and stood beside it, 2 against 1. The swordsman slashed. She dodged. The spirit attacked. She attacked. They moved as one. The swordsman couldn't handle the pressure. He opened up for a second. She struck. He fell. The stands erupted. The healer faced the paladin from the Southern Academy. The paladin was certain of victory. His holy magic blazed gold. He struck. The healer caught his hand. Reverse healing surged into the paladin's body. His muscles cramped. His joints seized up. The paladin fell like a felled oak and could not rise. The hall couldn't believe it. The healer had defeated the paladin with a single touch. Of the 11 students, 4 remained for the semifinals. Kell, the summoner, the healer, and Mira. Little, quiet Mira from the trash class who hadn't lost a single fight. Her class was herbalist, the worst combat class after Necromancer. According to canon, an herbalist stays in the supply train and gathers medicinal plants. She has no place in battle. Mira had invested her points in dexterity and perception. She moved like Mercury. Her hands were fast. Incredibly fast. And every touch carried the poisons that a herbalist could create out of thin air. 1 touch and the opponent's muscles weakened. 2 touches and he couldn't lift his weapon. 3 and he was down. She made it through the quarterfinals without taking a single hit. 4 in the semifinals. Kell against the healer. Mira against the summoner. Kell defeated the healer in a minute. Reverse healing didn't work on someone whose will was iron. Kell withstood the touch and responded with a fist. The healer went down. Mira defeated the summoner in 2 minutes. She was too fast. The guardian spirit couldn't catch her. The summoner herself certainly couldn't. 3 touches. The summoner sat down in the sand and couldn't get up. 2 heretics in the final. Kell and Mira. The arena roared. But the final wasn't between them. The organizers announced that the format of the final had been changed. By decision of the Conclave of Magisters, the final would be a team battle. The 2 High March finalists against the 2 best canonical fighters of the tournament, Cassius Vane, representative of the Vane family, and a certain Varen Steele, champion of the Iron Hall Academy and a Sword Master Guard. 2 against 2, canon against heresy. Kell looked at Mira. Mira looked at him. She nodded. In the stands, Helga stood up. Seraphine stood up. Leora stood up. Garrick stood up. They stood and looked down at the arena, where 2 from the slums were preparing to fight against the world's best canonical fighters. The Conclave had changed the rules to destroy them, given them not 1 but 2 opponents, each of whom was a champion. Magister Varath sat in the box, his lips pressed into a thin line. This had to work. 2 perfect canon fighters against 2 heretics. The math was on the canon's side. The math had never worked against Kell. But Varath believed in the canon, just as he had for 1,000 years. The arena fell silent. 20,000 spectators held their breath. 4 fighters stepped onto the sand. On one side, Cassius in full Vane family armor, and Varen Steele in the silver armor of the Iron Hall Academy. 2 ideals, 2 canonical perfections. On the other side, Kell with rags on his hands, and Mira with empty palms. 2 orphans from the slums, 2 nobodies, who were about to shatter the world. The signal. 4 bodies sprang into motion simultaneously. Cassius lunged at Kell, sword in his right hand, shield in his left. His eyes burned, not with anger, with determination. He had been heading toward this battle his whole life. He just didn't know it. Varen's steel moved toward Mira. 2 blades. A guardian swordsman, a class that combined attack and defense. The perfect build, the perfect technique, the perfect canon. Mira slipped to the side. Her movements were fluid. She didn't stand still for a second. Varen slashed at thin air. Every strike was flawless. Every strike missed. Mira was everywhere and nowhere. Mercury, a shadow, smoke, a touch. Mira's fingers brushed Varen's wrist for a split second. The healer's poison seeped into her skin. Varen jerked her arm away. The muscles in her wrist cramped. Her grip on the right sword loosened. Mira touched her again, the left shoulder. Varen hissed. Her shoulder went numb. The left blade dropped. Mira moved around her like a wasp around a bear, small, fast, venomous. Varen was stronger, more experienced, more skilled, but she couldn't land a hit, and with every touch, Mira took a piece of her body. On the other side of the arena, Kell and Cassius clashed. It was their 3rd fight, and it wasn't like the previous ones. Cassius had changed. He moved differently, not by the book. His strikes were rougher, harsher, less technical, but more alive. He had learned. Watching Kell, he had unwittingly absorbed something of his style. Wildness, unpredictability, a willingness to break the rules. His sword traced an arc not found in any textbook. Kell barely dodged. The blade sliced through the fabric on his shoulder. Blood. Cassius struck with his shield. Not by the book, with the edge, from bottom to top, like they fought on the street. Kell recoiled. His eyebrows rose for a moment. Cassius wasn't fighting by the rules. The heir to the Vane family, an exemplary knight. For the first time in his life, he was breaking his own rules. Kell felt something unexpected. Respect. Cassius was pressing. Every blow was heavier than the last. Every move more dangerous. He had thrown out everything he'd been taught and was fighting as he felt. No formula, no pattern, without a canon, and he grew stronger, much stronger. Kell took a sword blow to the ribs, shallow but painful. He took a shield blow to the cheekbone. His vision darkened for a second. Cassius wouldn't let him summon skeletons. He knew this tactic. He'd prepared for it. Every time Kell stomped his foot on the ground, Cassius attacked and disrupted the summoning. Kell fought without the undead. 1-on-1. Just like in the school tournament finals. Only now, Cassius was different. Stronger. Freer. More dangerous. 20,000 spectators held their breath. 2 battles were raging simultaneously. Mira danced around Varen, claiming her body touch by touch. Kell and Cassius were tearing each other to pieces. Blood from both of them dripped onto the sand. Varen's steel fell first. Her body gave out. The healer's poisons paralyzed her muscles one by one. She was on her knees and couldn't lift a single blade. Mira stood before her. Small, quiet, undefeated. A girl from the slums with a trash class background who had just taken down the Iron Hall champion. The arena roared. Mira stepped back. She turned toward Kell's fight and froze. Kell lay on the sand. Cassius stood over him, a sword at his throat. Blood flowed from Kell's split eyebrow, from his split lip, from a gash in his ribs. Cassius was covered in blood too. His nose was broken. His right eye was swollen shut. His shield was dented, but he stood, and Kell lay there. 20,000 spectators held their breath. The conclave box leaned forward. Magister Varath allowed himself a faint smile. The canon prevails, as it should be. Cassius looked down at Kell, a sword at his throat. One move and the fight is over. Cassius spoke, quietly, so that only Kell could hear. He said that Kell was right, that the canons were a cage, that he himself had just fought outside the canon, and, for the first time in his life, felt free. He said he acknowledged that. But he also said he had to win. For his family, for his house, for everything he'd been given. Kell lay there, staring at the blade at his throat. Then he smiled. For the first time ever, for real. He told Cassius that he'd just proven him right better than any scroll ever could. The heir to the Vane clan had broken his own canon, and had become stronger. Cassius froze. His hand wavered. For a single second. Kell kicked the ground. Not for skeletons. Sand flew into Cassius's eyes. A dirty trick, street style. Cassius recoiled. Kell sprang up. Left fist to the body, right elbow to the temple. Cassius staggered. Kell grabbed him by the shoulder and yanked him down. A knee met his chin. Cassius's head snapped back. His eyes went blank. He was falling. Slowly. Just like 6 months ago. Just like the tower. Kell caught him. Didn't let him fall face first into the sand. Set him down on the ground. Gently. Cassius lay on his back, blinking. Conscious, but his body wouldn't obey him. He looked up at Kell, and for the first time in all that time, for the first time in all those months of hatred and anger and shame, Cassius Vane smiled. He said one word. He said that Kell had won. The arena was silent for a second. 2, 3. Then it exploded. 20,000 voices, a scream, a roar, thunder, not applause, something more, the sound of a world collapsing. Kell stood in the center of the arena, covered in blood, with shattered fists. Mira stood beside him, small and quiet. In the stands stood his students, the alchemist, the summoner, the healer, all those the canons had written off, all those who had risen. Kell raised his head. He looked at the conclave's box. Magister Verath sat motionless. His face was gray. He saw everything he had guarded for 1,000 years crumble. Kell pulled a scroll from his bosom, ancient, yellowed. He raised it above his head. Leora stood in the professor's box. She held a manuscript in her hands, her new monograph, The Free System. 200 pages of proof that the canons were a lie. Kell spoke. His voice was soft, but the arena fell silent, and every word reached the back row. He said that 1,000 years ago, the Conclave of Masters had imposed rules on the continent that they called the canons. He said those rules were lies. He said the system had always been free, that points could be allocated however one wished, that magic depended not on the right stats, but on will. That correct builds were a cage designed to make mages obedient and predictable. He said he knew this because he had done what no one had done in 1,000 years. He had become a necromancer who strikes harder than knights. His students became what the canons forbade them to be. The healer became a warrior. The alchemist became a fighter. The herbalist became deadly. And every one of them triumphed. Because the system rewards not obedience, but freedom. He raised the scroll higher. He said this was proof. A record from 1,000 years ago. An admission from those who created the cage. He said anyone could read it. Anyone could verify it. Anyone could open their system and invest points wherever they wished, and see what would happen. Master Verath stood up. He wanted to say something. But 20,000 people were looking at him, and he saw the question in their eyes. The same question that had burned in Kell's students' eyes from day one. What if he was right? Verath sat down. He couldn't find the words, because there were no words, because the truth stood in the arena, covered in blood and with broken fists, and it couldn't be denied. Kell looked at the arena. At Cassius, who lay on the sand and smiled. At Mira, who stood nearby and warm. At the stands where Helga kept her hand on her sword and her eyes were warm for the first time. Where Seraphine stood with her back straight and the golden light on her palms burning brighter than ever. Where Leora clutched to her chest the manuscript that would rewrite the history of magic. Where Garrick was crying. unashamedly. The 60-year-old man stood in the stands and cried because finally, after 40 years, the cage they'd put him in had been broken. Not just his, everyone's. Kell lowered the scroll. He rubbed his bruised knuckles. He looked at the hushed hall and said calmly, "For 1,000 years, they told you who you could be. A necromancer is a weakling. A healer stands in the back. A herbalist gathers flowers. Do what you're supposed to. Don't break the rules." He brushed the blood off his fist. "The system is free. It always was. You were simply lied to. Create whoever you want. There are no more rules." 20,000 people were silent. Then, somewhere in the upper rows, someone clapped. One person, then a second, a third, a 10th, a 100th, a 1,000th. The applause rolled in like a wave, like an avalanche, like the collapse of a 1,000-year-old wall. Kell stood in the center of the arena. Mira was beside him. Surrounding them were 20,000 people who, for the first time in their lives, had heard the truth. The era of the canons was over. The era of freedom had begun. And it began with an orphan from the slums who didn't know how to read the rules because he broke them.